There's a hum that lives in the walls of every airport, a kind of low, constant vibration that echoes with the sounds of engines, footsteps, and overhead announcements. For over 2 decades, that hum had been my soundtrack. I had spent thousands of hours in the cockpit, soaring above the clouds, navigating storms and landing smoothly on icy runways. My logbook was thick with entries, each line a testament to a flight completed safely and professionally. I loved everything about flying: the hiss of hydraulics during pre-flight checks, the steady glow of the cockpit instruments, the calm thrill of takeoff when the plane lifted from the ground, weightless and free. I had flown through hurricanes, navigated engine malfunctions, even brought a Boeing 737 down safely after a complete electrical failure over the Atlantic. Safety was my creed, precision my habit. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. So when the memo came through that we were under new management, I didn't think much of it. Management shifted every few years, new faces, new policies, the usual routine. But this time it felt different. Rumors trickled in from the ground crew and stewards, whispers of efficiency over tradition, of cutting the fat, words that didn't sit well with me. The first time I met Richard Kane was in the pilot's lounge. He swept in with a tailored suit, slicked back hair, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wasn't alone. 2 other men in business attire flanked him, both clutching tablets and murmuring numbers. Richard had the look of a man more comfortable behind a boardroom table than the controls of an aircraft. I wasn't far off. "Morning, gentlemen," he greeted us, flashing a toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Richard Kane, your new director of operations. We're going to be making a few changes around here, modernizing, cutting inefficiencies, making this airline leaner and more profitable." A few of the younger pilots nodded eagerly, but I felt my jaw tighten. Leaner and more profitable. I knew what that meant: less time, less maintenance, more risk. The next few weeks were a blur of policy shifts. The pre-flight checklists, once meticulous and thorough, were now expected to be completed in half the time. "We're just trimming the fat," Richard explained during one of our first meetings. "Do you really need 20 minutes to inspect the hydraulics? 10 should be more than enough." I raised an eyebrow. "You cut those checks, you're cutting into safety. We don't rush pre-flights for a reason." Richard leaned back in his chair, his smile never faltering. "The data shows that most of those checks are redundant. We've got top-of-the-line equipment. These planes practically fly themselves." I could feel the eyes of my colleagues darting between us, the silence heavy and uncomfortable. I wasn't about to back down. "Practically isn't good enough when you're 30,000 feet in the air," I shot back. The smile faded just a fraction. "Maybe you're just used to the old ways," he replied smoothly. "But we're moving forward. Efficiency is the name of the game." From that day on, tension simmered just below the surface. Richard pushed for faster turnaround times, smaller fuel reserves, and quicker de-icing procedures. He cut back on maintenance cycles, labeling them overkill. I pushed back when I could. I filed reports, cited safety regulations, even brought up past incidents where cut corners had led to disaster. But each time, Richard brushed it off with corporate lingo and charts that, somehow, always showed everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It was dangerous. And as I stood there in the cockpit one late afternoon, going through my full checklist despite his new efficiency protocols, I knew a storm was coming. I could feel it building, a pressure waiting to burst. Richard Kane thought he could cut costs and fly safely. But he didn't understand the skies the way I did. Up there, thousands of feet above the earth, there was no room for shortcuts. Up there, the only thing between life and death was preparation, and I intended to make sure he learned that the hard way. The changes came quicker than I expected. Richard wasted no time pushing through his new policies, each one designed to shave off minutes and cut costs, never mind the risk. I remember the first email blast, bright and bold in my inbox. New efficiency standards, streamlined pre-flight procedures. The document attached was a horror show. Checklists had been slashed in half. Maintenance inspections were now suggested instead of mandatory, and fuel calculations were trimmed to bare minimum reserves. In my 20 years of flying, I'd never seen anything so reckless. I sat in the pilot's lounge, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. A few younger pilots were huddled nearby, chatting nervously. "Did you see the new fuel guidelines?" one whispered. "We're barely carrying enough for the route." "Yeah, it's nuts," another agreed. "They're calling it a fuel efficiency initiative." Fuel efficiency. That was Richard's shiny new phrase, thrown around at every safety briefing like a badge of honor. I couldn't help but snort when I first heard it. Efficiency had its place, sure, but not at 35,000 feet. Up there you wanted excess, extra, redundancy, because when things went wrong, you didn't have the luxury of pulling over. It all came to a head during one of the mandatory safety briefings. Richard stood at the front of the room, his suit perfectly pressed, smile perfectly fake. "We're moving into a new era of streamlined operations," he announced, voice dripping with confidence. "We've analyzed the data, and these new measures will save us millions annually while keeping us competitive. We're reducing unnecessary steps and optimizing turnaround times." I raised my hand and his eyes landed on me. "Yes, Captain?" he asked, voice clipped. I stood, glancing around the room before speaking. "And what happens when we're flying on fumes because of your efficiency? What happens when maintenance misses a critical check because you decided it was unnecessary?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Richard only smiled. "We trust our planes, Captain. Our systems are modern, top of the line. They don't need the same babysitting as the old days." I clenched my fists. "That babysitting you're talking about has saved countless lives. Those checks exist for a reason." The room went silent. Richard's smile faded. "You sound like you're stuck in the past. Aviation has evolved. Maybe you haven't." I sat back down, my blood boiling. He moved on with his presentation, but I caught the sideways glances from my peers. Some looked supportive, others looked scared. Richard had a way of making you feel like you were either with him or against him. A month later, it came to a head. I was scheduled to fly an international route, New York to London. The plane, a Boeing 777, was prepped and ready on the tarmac, or so I was told. But when I did my usual pre-flight walk-around, things didn't look right. The nose gear was showing signs of unusual wear. Oil streaked the undercarriage, and one of the flaps seemed slightly misaligned. I flagged a mechanic. He looked at it, shrugged, and handed me a clipboard. "Signed off by Richard himself," he said. "Said it was within tolerance." "Within tolerance?" I snapped. "That's a half-inch of play in the flaps. That's not normal." He just shrugged again, clearly used to this routine now. "Look, Captain, it's been signed off. I don't make the rules." I didn't make the rules either, but I knew when something was wrong. I marched back into the terminal, past the bustling passengers, and straight into Richard's office. He was on the phone, gesturing wildly about some new cost analysis. I didn't wait. "That plane's not ready to fly." He looked up, covering the mouthpiece. "Excuse me?" "The 777. It's not flight-worthy. There's gear wear and flap issues. It's a disaster waiting to happen." He sighed dramatically, dropping the phone into its cradle. "You've become quite the alarmist lately, haven't you?" "This isn't alarmism. It's safety. If that plane takes off, you're putting 200 people at risk." Richard leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "It's been signed off. The numbers are good. You're just resistant to change." "I'm resistant to crashing," I shot back. "I'm not flying it." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "If you don't fly it, I'll find someone who will." "That's your call." I folded my arms, staring him down, his eyes narrowed. "You're refusing an assigned flight. That's insubordination, if that's what you want to call it." He stepped back, a thin smile creeping across his face. "Fine, I'll make sure this is reflected in your file." I walked out of his office, fists clenched so hard my knuckles were white. He wanted to play games with people's lives for the sake of a profit margin. I knew then that it was only a matter of time before his arrogance met reality, and I intended to be there when it did. The call came at 8:45 in the morning, right as I was finishing my third cup of coffee and reviewing the weather patterns for my next flight. My phone buzzed on the desk, the display flashing HR mandatory review. I frowned, setting my mug down. HR meetings weren't exactly routine, especially not without notice. I glanced at my schedule, nothing unusual, just the standard pre-flight checks and a 6-hour haul to Denver. I tucked my logbook under my arm, slipped my headset into its case, and made my way to the far side of the terminal where the glass-walled HR offices sat like a fishbowl in the middle of the busy concourse. I stepped inside to find Richard already, seated, legs crossed, hands clasped neatly on the table. Beside him sat Linda from HR, her expression as neutral as always. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite them. I set my things down and sank into the seat, my back straightening instinctively. "What's this about?" Linda adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "We've called you in for a performance review." I blinked. "A performance review?" I wasn't aware I was up for one. Richard leaned forward, a faint smile curling his lips. "We decided it was necessary, given recent concerns." "Concerns?" I repeated, feeling the word roll bitterly off my tongue. Linda shuffled some papers and began reading off a list. "We've noted repeated incidents of inefficiency, refusal to adapt to updated procedures, and causing delays due to, let me see here, excessive caution during pre-flight checks." I stared at her, then at Richard. "Excessive caution?" Scoffed. "You mean doing my job? Ensuring the plane is safe before I take 300 souls into the sky?" Richard's smile didn't falter. "There's a fine line between caution and paranoia. You've been crossing it." I leaned forward, voice steady but firm. "I have a perfect safety record, 0 incidents. Not one emergency landing, not one mechanical failure under my watch. Hell, I've got over 20 commendations from passengers alone for safe, smooth flights. How does that add up to inefficiency?" Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Richard's eyes hardened. "It's not just about your record. It's about adaptability. We're moving toward streamlined operations. Efficiency is the name of the game, and you're still playing by the old rulebook." I felt the blood rush to my face, my fists clenching under the table. "The old rulebook is what keeps those planes from falling out of the sky." "That's enough," Richard said sharply, his smile finally disappearing. He glanced at Linda, giving her a nod. She hesitated, then slid a beige envelope across the table. "What's this?" I asked, not touching it. Linda's eyes dropped to her hands. "It's your severance package, effective immediately." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The room tilted slightly, the sounds of the airport muffled behind the thick glass walls. "Effective immediately?" I repeated, voice barely above a whisper. Richard stood, buttoning his suit jacket as if he'd just finished a pleasant lunch. "Your refusal to adapt has been noted multiple times. You've ignored direct instructions, refused assigned flights, and you're stuck in the past. We need pilots who are willing to move forward." I sat there, frozen, 20 years, 2 decades of flawless flights, emergency landings pulled off with precision, storms navigated without a hitch. And it was over. Just like that. "You can't be serious," I said finally, voice cracking just a bit. "I've given my life to this airline." Richard's smile returned, colder this time. "And we appreciate your service. But the skies are changing. You couldn't keep up." Linda cleared her throat, standing slowly. "Security will escort you to your locker. You can collect your things and... Well, I'm very sorry." I stood, my hands numb, fingers barely able to grip the envelope. Outside the glass, the world moved on. Passengers scurried to their gates, families hugged goodbye, and planes taxied down the runway. It felt surreal, like I was watching my own life play out from behind a screen. 2 uniformed security guards met me outside the office, their expressions neutral but respectful. They walked me down the long corridor to the crew area, where my locker sat, untouched since my last flight. I opened it with trembling hands, pulling out my headset, my logbook, and my uniform patches. My fingers grazed the fabric, the stitched wings that symbolized everything I had built. The guards offered me a small cardboard box, and I packed my things in silence. When I was done, they led me through the terminal, past the bustling crowds and the bright screens flashing departure times. I saw a few colleagues watching from the corners of their eyes, whispers trailing behind me. At the exit, I stopped, turning back for one last look at the building I'd dedicated my life to. The smell of jet fuel, the crackle of announcements, the distant roar of engines. It was everything I knew. But as I stepped out onto the curb with that small cardboard box in my hands, I knew one thing for certain. Richard might have pushed me out of the skies, but he hadn't grounded me. Not yet, and soon enough he'd understand why. The days after my firing were surreal. A strange, hollow silence filled my home where the familiar hum of jet engines used to echo. I'd wake up at dawn out of habit, instinctively reaching for my flight log and headset before remembering that it was over. My uniform hung in the closet like a ghost, the stitched wings a reminder of 2 decades of dedication and flawless flights. Now, it felt like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath me, and I was left free-falling. I tried to keep myself busy, long walks, tinkering with the old Piper Cub I kept in my garage, even taking up fishing again. But the restlessness wouldn't go away. Flying was in my bones. It wasn't just a job, it was part of me. Without it, I felt untethered. The phone calls started trickling in after the first week. Laura from the control tower called first. We couldn't believe it when we heard everyone's talking about it, how they just cut you loose. I forced a laugh. Yeah, well, apparently I'm too old-fashioned, stuck in the past. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Richard's cutting everything. We're talking half the pre-flight checks, skipping maintenance rounds, even reducing fuel loads. It's dangerous. The knot in my stomach tightened. He's cutting maintenance? Yup. Ground crews stretched thin, and he's been authorizing older planes to stay in rotation longer. We've got 737s running back-to-back, with barely a break. It's not right. My jaw clenched. Richard was playing with fire. Planes weren't like cars. You couldn't just run them until they break. Up there, a minor failure could become a disaster in seconds. I thanked her for the call, but my mind was already racing. Curiosity, or maybe it was instinct, pushed me toward my laptop. I logged into a few aviation forums I frequented, places where pilots swapped stories, compared flight paths, and sometimes vented about company policies. It didn't take long before I started finding the posts. Anybody else notice the maintenance? Schedules getting shorter? We had a flap issue mid-flight, wasn't even flagged in pre-check. Flew out of JFK yesterday. Turbulence hit hard, but something felt off. The plane just didn't handle like it used to. I clicked through thread after thread, my hands gripping the edge of my desk tighter with every post. Reports of near misses, shaky takeoffs, and emergency landings were starting to spread. Pilots were complaining about shorter turnaround times, less fuel in reserve, and older planes being pushed past their recommended flight hours. I wasn't alone in my suspicions. Former colleagues reached out through private messages, sharing what they'd seen. Richard's pushing us to turn planes around faster than ever. Maintenance is getting rubber stamped without real checks. A couple of mechanics even quit, said they didn't want their names tied to it. My blood ran cold. I knew the risks. Planes were marvels of engineering, but they weren't invincible. If you didn't treat them right, inspect every bolt, test every system, they could turn from masterpieces of human achievement to metal coffins in an instant. I started digging deeper. Social media was ablaze with posts from passengers. Our plane dropped so suddenly I thought we were crashing. Worst turbulence of my life. The pilot came on the speaker sounding panicked. We had to emergency land. Flight attendants said it was a mechanical issue, but it felt like the whole plane was falling apart. Photos accompanied. Some of the posts, cracks near the cabin door, oil streaks under the wings, flickering cabin lights. Things that should never happen on a properly maintained aircraft. My hands trembled as I saved screenshots and copied links. If Richard was cutting maintenance cycles and pushing older planes back into service, he wasn't just risking the company's reputation, he was endangering lives. The final straw came when I found a leaked internal memo posted anonymously in one of the pilot forums. It detailed Richard's new policy for streamlined maintenance, which effectively meant running planes until issues were visible before addressing them. It was pure insanity. Planes weren't supposed to limp their way to repairs. They were supposed to be flawless before ever leaving the tarmac. My jaw clenched as I leaned back in my chair, the screen still glowing with the words, cost efficiency and streamlined maintenance. Cost efficiency. That was Richard's magic word. The reason I was out of a job, the reason maintenance was slipping, and the reason turbulence was increasing. It was only a matter of time before those minor issues became major disasters. And that's when I knew I couldn't just sit here and watch it happen. I'd spent my life flying those planes safely through storms, mechanical failures, and worse. I wasn't about to let someone like Richard turn them into death traps. I picked up my phone and dialed the first name that came to mind. Laura. "I need a favor," I said when she picked up. "Get me whatever you can on those maintenance schedules. Everything." She hesitated, then sighed. "You're really going after him?" "You're damn right I am." She was quiet for a moment. Then her voice hardened. "I'll get you what you need." I hung up, a sense of purpose thrumming through my veins. Richard wanted efficiency, wanted to cut corners. He was about to find out just how sharp those corners could be. I had always been a pilot, not an investigator. But desperation has a way of sharpening focus. With Laura's help, I gathered what I could. Maintenance logs, shift reports, even photos snapped discreetly by ground crew. But it wasn't enough. I needed more than just whispers and rumors. I needed proof, solid, indisputable evidence that Richard's cost-cutting wasn't just dangerous, it was criminal. The first breakthrough came from Pete, a mechanic who had been with the company for nearly as long as I had. He met me at a corner table in a run-down diner just outside the airport perimeter. His hands were calloused, stained with engine grease that never quite washed out, and he wore the weary look of someone who'd been asked to do more with less for far too long. He slid a folder across the table, his eyes darting around nervously. "These are the maintenance logs," he whispered, voice barely above a murmur. "I made copies before they disappeared from the system. Richard's been authorizing planes for flight that should have been grounded months ago." I opened the folder and felt my breath catch. Page after page listed deferred maintenance, skipped inspections, and parts marked reusable that had no business leaving the warehouse. Landing gear components with extended life cycles, hydraulic lines stretched beyond safe limits. It was all there, black and white proof of negligence. "And that's not the worst of it," Pete added, tapping a particular log. "He's been using old stock, parts that were supposed to be decommissioned." "That's illegal," I whispered, hardly believing it. He nodded, eyes heavy with regret. "He's been getting away with it because the turnover rate's so high. New guys don't know any better, and the old ones, well, they either fall in line or get pushed out, like you." I clenched my jaw, fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I won't let this slide." He looked at me with something close to hope. "I didn't think you would." Armed with the documents, I made my next call, to Sarah, a flight attendant. I'd known for years. If anyone saw the state of those planes up close, it was her. She was hesitant at first, but after some convincing, she shared her own horror stories. Loose seats, flickering cabin lights, faulty emergency doors. Issues that had been reported but never fixed. I spent the next week compiling everything, testimonies from co-pilots, signed affidavits from mechanics, and anonymous statements from flight attendants. With Laura's access to scheduling logs, I cross-referenced them with emergency landings and turbulence incidents. The patterns were there, clear as day. But I needed to go bigger. The local news wasn't enough. This was bigger than a regional scandal. This was national. I called a contact I'd met years ago during a safety conference, a reporter named Martin Green. He worked for a major news network and had a reputation for exposing corporate negligence. I laid it all out for him. maintenance logs, cockpit, audio where pilots reported issues mid-flight, passenger complaints brushed aside by customer service. He listened in silence, then spoke with a weight in his voice that I hadn't heard before. "This is huge. I'll need verification, but if this checks out, we're going live with it." And it did. Within a week, the first story broke. Whistleblower exposes dangerous airline practices. Safety compromised for cost savings. The photos, the documents, the testimonials, they were all there. Within hours, the story spread. Social media lit up with passengers sharing their own horror stories. Emergency landings, turbulence that felt like free fall, engine stalls mid-flight. Lawsuits came next. The families of passengers who had been injured in turbulence filed class action suits, citing negligence and endangerment. More former employees came forward, emboldened by the exposure, sharing their own stories of intimidation and cover-ups. It became a flood, too much for Richard to contain. I watched it all unfold from my living room, fingers curled around a mug of coffee as news anchors dissected every detail. Today, multiple lawsuits have been filed against Vista Sky Airlines, alleging severe negligence and safety violations. Reports suggest maintenance was repeatedly deferred, and older planes were kept in rotation well past their service life. Richard was dragged into the spotlight, his polished smile replaced by a grim mask of stress. I saw him on the screen, standing behind a podium, stacks of paper in front of him. The press conference was tense. Reporters fired off questions faster than he could dodge them. "Mr. Kane, is it true that you authorized outdated parts to be used on long-haul flights? Were maintenance checks falsified to save money? What do you have to say to the passengers who were injured due to turbulence on Flight 472? He fumbled, clutching the edges of the podium. "These allegations are being taken seriously. We are conducting a full internal investigation and cooperating with the FAA. His voice wavered, eyes darting like a trapped animal. But it was too late. The lawsuits piled up, investors pulled their funding, and the board of directors began to distance themselves. Bookings plummeted as public trust evaporated. The final nail in the coffin came 2 weeks later, when the FAA announced a full investigation into Vista Sky's maintenance practices and flight logs. For the first time in years, the airline's stock dropped to a record low, and Richard Kane was forced to resign to focus on his personal matters. I turned off the TV, the silence in my living room feeling more like victory than emptiness. I had flown thousands of miles through storms, mechanical failures, and chaos, always bringing my passengers home safely. Richard thought he could cut corners and stay aloft. He forgot one simple truth: the sky doesn't tolerate shortcuts. 6 months after Richard's empire crumbled, I stood at the front of a bright, open-concept office space, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. My name was etched in bold lettering on the glass door: Altitude Aviation Consultancy. It was more than just a name. It was a promise that safety would never again be compromised for profit. The space was a far cry from the sterile, cost-cut corners of Vista Sky's cramped offices. Here, pilots and engineers shared ideas, pored over maintenance logs, and analyzed flight simulations in real time. It was a hub of innovation and respect for the craft of flying, something that Richard had never understood. When the story broke, my phone had rung nonstop. Old colleagues, mechanics, even a few corporate executives who had watched Richard's recklessness from the sidelines called me with offers of support. Some had quit the airline in protest. Others had been pushed out, like me, for daring to value safety over speed. Laura was the first to join. She walked into the new office on opening day with her headset in one hand and a box of manuals in the other. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" I asked, a grin spreading across my face. "Not a chance," she replied, setting the box down with a satisfying thud. "Let's make flying safe again." Next came Pete, the mechanic who'd risked his job to leak the maintenance logs. He brought with him a handful of engineers, people who knew what a well-oiled machine should look like, and weren't afraid to call out flaws when they saw them. Our team grew steadily, built on integrity, not shortcuts. The demand was instant. Airlines wanted to restore their reputations. Passengers wanted to feel safe again. And our firm became the bridge to that trust. We launched a series of pilot proficiency programs, training new and seasoned pilots alike on proper safety procedures, emergency protocols, and most importantly, the art of thorough pre-flight checks. The simulation rooms became a hive of activity, virtual. Cockpits lined up in rows where pilots ran drills for everything from engine fires to hydraulic failures. Our mantra was simple: if you're prepared for the worst, the best is always possible. A few months later, I found myself on stage at an aviation safety panel, speaking to a crowd of hundreds, pilots, engineers, regulators, and CEOs. It was surreal, standing there as an advocate for safety when just a year before, I had been walked out of an airport with nothing but a cardboard box. I took a breath and faced the audience. Aviation is built on three things: precision, trust, and integrity. You can't cut corners on any of them, not for profit, not for time, not for anything. The room erupted in applause, but I could only think of the passengers. They were the reason we did this. Richard didn't understand that. His obsession with cost-cutting had collapsed under its own weight. Vista Sky had filed for bankruptcy within 4 months of the lawsuits, and Richard himself was under investigation for corporate negligence. I heard whispers of a trial, FAA violations, falsified maintenance reports, and endangerment of passengers. I wouldn't be testifying. I didn't need to. His arrogance had already spoken for him. My focus was forward. Our consultancy grew, expanding into aircraft certification and safety auditing. Airlines contracted us to perform surprise inspections, and our recommendations were put into action immediately. It wasn't just about flying. It was about flying right. One afternoon, as I was reviewing simulator training footage, Laura stepped into my office. "You're going to want to see this," she said, a grin spreading across her face. I followed her out to the training room where a group of young pilots, fresh out of the academy, were completing their final emergency landing simulation. The screens lit up with weather overlays, hydraulic failures, and turbulence simulations. One by one, they brought the planes down safely, methodically, just as we had trained them. When the final plane touched virtual ground, the room burst into applause. The pilots shook hands, congratulated each other, and I saw it. The look I once had. That fire, that passion for not just flying, but flying safely. Laura nudged me. "Looks like you did it," she said. "No," I replied, watching the new pilots laugh and pat each other on the back. "We did it." As I stood there, watching the next generation of aviators take to the skies with respect for the craft and an uncompromising dedication to safety, I felt a weight lift. Richard had tried to cut costs and fly fast, but aviation doesn't forgive recklessness. I had built something stronger, an unshakable foundation where safety was sacred and integrity wasn't negotiable. And I knew that, no matter the turbulence, this time we would always land safely.